So we have successfully created the Whig views of history, right? So we have looked at the idea of the linear progress from 1832 all the way to 1911. We've identified the evolution of the franchise. We saw the franchise evolve from 1832, 1867, 1884 into the 20th century. We see all these elements, and yet we know that in England, women had no political voice. Now we're going to turn our attention on the British policy in Ireland. And this is an area in which the Whiggish view of history completely ignored. So, what is the Irish question? The Irish question is what is going to happen to Ireland? There's a sense of chaos and frustration. And what we see here is the progress, right? So, here in 1800, there's an active union, and the Irish Parliament is disbanded. So Ireland now is only going to have a handful of votes in the British Parliament. So they're really going to lose their political voice. They're no longer heard. They're not independent in any way, shape, or form. They have forged or became part of that union, and yet they're not going to be represented. We know that the Great Hunger or the Great Famine, they really saw the British MPs and the other elites really expand over the control of land. They utilized banks' loans to confiscate land, to uh, evict people from land at the worst part. So instead of the government creating policies to support the Irish people, by the time we get to 1860, it is clear that the Irish feel only oppressed. And we also know the British oppressed Irish Catholicism. They ignored during this time period. The Irish actually had to pay taxes and things to the Anglican Church. And then we see the development of racism. And this racism is very different than we see it today. Racism was not just about color of skin, it was about the different ethnicities. And the British viewed the Irish as an inferior subhuman group, degenerated. And that's why they couldn't really afford the idea of suffrage and other elements. I like this political cartoon here. You have the picture of organization, civilization from the English, the law, order, and on the other side, you have anarchy. And the anarchy is the Irishman who's chaotic. You can't trust them. So it's playing to some of these stereotypes. And this led us right into the Irish Schism. The Irish Republican Brotherhood were Irish Catholic nationalists who demanded home rule. They wanted their parliament back. They wanted land reform. They wanted to get the British out of Ireland. They utilized terrorism to to call attention to their cause. This again, something where we would view it as terrorism bad. They would view it as freedom fighting because the Irish Republican Brotherhood did not have the resources to compete against the British Army. And the British Army, they maintained some of their strongest forces in Ireland to keep rebellion at bay. And I like this Fenian Brotherhood image that kind of associates right there. And then you have the Ulsterites. And the Ulsterites, something I had not heard before this textbook, so I went back. These are the Protestants who had migrated over generations into Northern Ireland. And I want to point out, to a certain degree, this is kind of like the United States westward momentum, right? Where the United States would destabilize the Native Americans, create warfare, and push them out, creates that so-called quote unquote empty land for settlers. This is exactly what happened during this time period over the last 100 or 200 years. Many of the Catholic Irish are forced out, and that's going to see a migration of Englishmen and Welsh into this area, and they're going to make it into a Protestant stronghold. And not surprisingly, they fear that if Ireland became a Catholic country, that they themselves would face persecution. Why would they fear this? Because they've seen what their policies have done to the Irish. People of power do not want it to be reversed upon themselves. And this creates the schism. There's no way the schism can get what they want. The Irish Republican Army wants an independent Ireland, at best, at worst, under home rule, where the Ulsterites wants to continue the British rule. There is no compromise between these two, and that's going to be the reason we see this polarization. And the Ulsterites, they form an army of over 100,000 members. So now all of a sudden we have a Ireland that's destabilized between two armed camps. So think about that. It has a feeling of the 30 Years' War when the Protestant Union versus the Catholic League. They had that concept of in which two armed camps are waiting. We're on the verge of a civil war. And this is a terrible moment. The Home Rule Act of 1914 does get passed finally through Parliament, but World War I is going to prevent it. So Ireland is now an oppressed area that feels that they don't have a voice, and the Ulsterites are thinking maybe we can maintain our power. And that kind of brings us to an end to this development of Great Britain and Ireland. So despite this Whiggish view of history, some really cool stuff that was happening with the evolution of political democracy in England, clearly with women and the Irish, there's not all their history was cool and patriotic. I hope that makes sense. We're going to get into the end lecture in a second.